Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are joining us today, 27th of April, for this fourth and final webinar in our synodal series, the theme of which is fleshing out the unity of love and truth. You might wonder why we have chosen this rather strange theme, fleshing out the unity of love and truth. It sounds a bit abstract and esoteric, but we took it from the synodal synthesis report from last October, and it is mentioned again in the working documents that came more recently from the Synod office, where they say, among the questions on which it is important to continue reflection, there is that of the relationship between love and truth and the repercussions that it has on many controversial issues. And then the Synod report also recognizes that sometimes the anthropological categories that we have elaborated are not sufficient to grasp the complexity of the elements that emerge from the experience or from the knowledge of the sciences and require refinement and further study. So the Synod office and those coordinating the Synod process are recognizing that it doesn't have all the answers, and that this dynamic of love and truth is something that the Synod process, the Synod discernment draws us to for much future reflection and discernment. So I'm pleased now to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, James Allison. James Allison is a Catholic priest, theologian, and author. He earned his doctorate from the Jesuit faculty in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. And James has lived in many countries and works as an itinerant preacher, lecturer, and retreat giver. He's known for his theological interpretation of the work of René Girard, especially in the fields of systematic and biblical theology over the years. James has firmly but gently faced down church authority on matters gay and lived to tell the tale, even in Madrid. Having been reaffirmed in his ministry by Pope Francis after an attempt to remove him from the priesthood. Texts, videos, homilies, recordings, and interviews of his can be accessed on his website, www.jamesallison.com. And when not on the road, as I've said, he lives in Madrid with the French bulldog, Nicholas. James, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. And I'm delighted and honored to be with you all. Good. And Martin has explained something of the history of the choice of this text, of this phrase, the unity of love and truth. And I want to say, I think it's a very good choice, not least because it's a favorite Ratzinger theme, as many as many of you will recognize. It was actually one of the key points of his first and best encyclical, Caritatis in Veritate. And, you know, basically he pointed out, and something which we all know, that if something is not loving, it is not truthful. And if something is not true, it is not loving. So he was aware of that. And we got a bad use of it, I'm afraid, in the 1986 document, which we all know and love, Homosexualitatis Problema, where basically one of the things he insisted on was that any pastoral work in this area, in order to be loving, had to be based on truth. And what he meant by truth then, of course, was the so-called magisterial teaching about objective disorder and intrinsically evil acts, which you all remember. Now, it seems to me to be absolutely right that one ought not to have a pastoral ministry based on other than what is true. The trouble is that what the church authority have said is true is clearly not true. So we have found ourselves having to work over the years in the sphere of trying to become truthful. And so what I like about this formulation, which we have, which is on our site, is several times, the synodal process refers several times to the unity of truth, of love and truth, that obviously serves as a very abstract compromise formula. And I think that the question of how do we inflesh that, fleshing out the unity of love and truth, is exactly the right question. Because, of course, the notion that truth is something external to human beings, which can be beamed down upon us by some sort of brilliant deduction and then applied to us, has been a terrible problem. It's an understanding of truth as a prioristic and intellectual, rather than a more modern concept of truthfulness, by which we become bearers of truth as we learn to love and as we accept being loved. And it's precisely that process, which I think we have all found ourselves just having to live into simply as a matter of survival. I think that this would be an appropriate way to describe the life story of any of us. People who have been trying to learn to become truthful in our loving and loving in our truthfulness, up and down all the ways. And by truthful, and I think this is an important point, I do not mean either honest or sincere. Sincerity is, if you like, how one justifies a mistaken position by saying, oh, well, at least I meant it. Oh, I'm terribly sincere, but I may be completely mistaken. So don't judge me too harshly. And honesty means, yes, I'm being as transparent as I can be, but I'm not necessarily truthful because of that. If you like, there is a subjective element in both sincerity and honesty, which are all important in themselves, but are not the same thing as finding ourselves adjusted to the reality of what is true. So I think that what we have had to do as gay and lesbian people over the last years is undergo a massive process of learning to become truthful and avoiding the attempts to say, oh, well, it's just hedonism. You're just giving voice to palpitations of your ego, or it's just your id has run away with itself, or other things which people have said to us over the years, as you know. And I want to say, no, actually, I think we have undergone a long process of learning to be truthful, learning to discover that we are part of a reality that is indeed, and this is one of the difficulties of the terminology which we have in these questions, is indeed objective, but not objective in the sense to which official teaching refers. So if I can go through the questions quickly. So what would a productive understanding of the unity of love and truth? Well, I want to say, I think that the first productive understanding is the one which we typically include in the word witness. I think that actually witness is the most important category for what I call the end game in matters LGBT, because ultimately the end game is going to be when people are able to recognize us as truth bearers, people who are bearing the truth in love and bearing love truthfully. It's when people say, gosh, they're just like us. That is the key moment. That was what happened with the Apostle Peter and the Gentiles. It's, gosh, they're just like us. And no amount of theology, no amount of authority, no amount of interpretation of scripture can do other than actually leave us quite vulnerable to each other as the bearers of truth and love who are recognized as witnesses. Yes, we can see that the life of Christ has been reproduced in your path towards being bearers of love and truth. So that seems to me to be the important thing, the recognition of a process leading to witness. Now, the next question is, how could an update of Catholic anthropology happen? I want to be careful about this term Catholic anthropology because many years ago, theological anthropology basically meant the doctrine of original sin and how one understood the fall and its effects. In fact, the late cardinal, not late because he's still a cardinal, the late prefect of the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith, Cardinal Lavaria, wrote the standard textbook on theological anthropology, which was certainly in use when I was studying in Brazil in the 1980s. And it was about that. It wasn't about anthropology in any sense that we would recognize from the discipline as a whole. What has happened since then is the attempt to create a new form of authority around the John Paul theology of the body, and the attempt, as far as I can see, to dress up old-fashioned Catholic theological anthropology in new clothes of a greater attentiveness towards bodiliness, but bodiliness understood very much in the most traditional sense of the mechanics of that which goes into which orifice. Now, so I want to be careful about an update of Catholic anthropology. Of course, I think it can happen. It can happen when those who try to use Catholic anthropology as a new form of saying, well, yes, of course, it's no longer the Bible. We can't use the Bible to be anti-gay because we realize that the anti-gay texts in the Bible don't really work. And the Pontifical Biblical Commission has said that. No, but it's the whole of Catholic anthropology. And so they want to brandish Catholic anthropology as a new form of fundamentalistic weapon, basing themselves in the John Paul theology of the body, or variant of it. Now, I think that can be updated, but it can only be updated when its bearers agree that the bodiliness of humans includes what I would call soft chemistry or soft biology. In other words, things like whatever it is that produces, as a matter of bodies, gay and lesbian bodies and trans bodies. In other words, the previous understanding presupposed that there was an objectivity to the body, which was, if you like, hard science. And then there was desire, which was in principle capable of being hedonistic and entirely wrong. And so gay people or trans people could be referred to as normal bodies that have got their patterns of desire entirely wrong. And we now know that to be a completely fake picture of the biology of the people involved. There are certainly biological elements in this. So, if you like, the endocrines, the hormones, and all of that, which go into configuring and making us the kind of people we are at least as much part of bodies as penises and vaginas. And I think it's important that we remember that. Now, for that to happen, it's going to require people to realize that if you're going to try and make a new fundamentalism out of a binary Catholic anthropology, then you're going down to a path to nowhere. It's simply going to be the next fake route to dystopian. Excuse me, someone is trying to call me and I can't shut them up. It's my son from Brazil. Okay, there we go. Am I still on?
Yeah.
Okay, do apologize. So the next question is, how can the church doctrine refer to human sciences? And for me, this was this was the most interesting question, which turned up in the synodal documents of the first thing, which was, as was told here, 15G and K, which was precisely the recognition that human sciences, the psychological and biological sciences, should be taken into account. And I was very pleased to see that it was passed by huge majorities. Now, if that is repeated, and I very much hope that it is, because I suspect that it will have been taken to be the next battleground. If that is repeated, then that will be a very strong permission for the Holy Father to tell the DDF to begin looking at these issues in the light of those sciences, which is one of the reasons why I was not very surprised that the most recent document, Dignitatis Infinita, did not go down that path, because the official permission for them to go down that path has not yet been given. I take it that there is some sort of order in this. So those for me are the two points within the Synod that I saw as most helpful. One, that really we should be, the Church is being asked to apply human sciences in this sphere. And incidentally, it should be pointed out that since Vatican II, which was the first time that the Council told the Church to apply modern sciences in this sphere, it has been applied just about in every sphere except the area of sex and marriage. So this is the area that was withheld, if you like, from inductive thinking, and now the request that inductive thinking be used rather than purely a prioristic thinking in this area, that is absolutely central for us to move forward. And it leads directly to the question, which is our next question: what is the status of post-personal social experience in theology? Well, the answer is it is absolutely part of the inductive process. And of course, we are all inductive learners. And what we very often do is we make little projections of deductive things from which we then work out whether they're true or not. So we have a curious mixture, I think, just as ordinary human beings, of a deductive and an inductive method. And it is this that lends us to becoming witnesses. Who do we learn to imitate? How do we learn to avoid being run by the voice of the mob? How do we become truth tellers, which means becoming self-critical about our own tendency to be caught up in the lies of the mob? And my guess is that most of us have had to do that in quite dramatic form for much of our lives, simply in order to survive. So the status of personal social experience in theology has been one of the great problems for official teaching, which, as you know, depended on a pre-subjective model, the Thomistic model, the Aristotelian model, and ever since the 19th century and the arrival of Hegel's thought, has had an enormous difficulty with coping with the discovery of subjectivity in theology altogether. And I think that now that the place of personal social experience in theology is vastly better, grounded than it would have been 100, 150 years ago. And I think would be pacifically accepted even by people who disagreed with us. But there we are. Now, how to unpack the tradition, objective disorder, sin, etc., behind the concepts of love and truth? Well, this is, and I'll just end with this. This is something which I don't think that there is any rescuing of those terms, of the terms objective disorder and intrinsically evil act in this sphere, because in the sphere of us, those terms are all a prioristic deductions from the marital act, from the assumption that there is only one good sexual act, and that is the marital act open to procreation. That is good. Everything else is a negative deduction from it. It's an intrinsically evil act if it couldn't possibly ever, under any circumstances, produce babies. The tendency itself is objectively disordered if it is pointing away from the object being a person of the other sex with whom you could have a baby. But here's the thing. We hear those words within a modern understanding which includes subjectivity. So for us, if somebody says something is objectively disordered, it means something like a disease or a pathology. And one of the things that we've learned is that same-sex orientation is not a pathology, with the result that what you have in essential is a clash of two incompatible worldviews. It's the equivalent of a clash between the Ptolemaic and Ptolemaic astronomy and Copernican astronomy. Ptolemaic astronomy was not entirely bad. It made some pretty close guesses about what's true about the relationships between stars, but it turned out to be lacking an absolutely fundamental turn, which was discovered by Copernicus when we became heliocentric. The Copernican turn meant that the Ptolemaic structure, well, as I say, had some interesting and useful things to say, became obsolete. And I'm afraid I think that we're, in the terms of these words, objective disorder, we are talking about the deliverances of an obsolete system. And one of the ways, curiously, that I teach people to get beyond this is simply by explaining to them how the system works. Once people understand that the only teaching we have about homosexuality is actually a purely a prioristic deduction from the marital act, they say, oh, good God, why have we been tortured by that? It's nothing to do with us. And I say, yes, you have understood this. This is excellent. Anyhow, please excuse me for having gone on too long, and I return you to Martin.
Thank you, James. And can you relieve us of the
Yes,
screen
I
share?
can. This will stop.
Thank you. Thank you. And well timed. Yes, yes, good. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Nyoka Jibaya. I hope I pronounced that more or less correctly. I'm delighted to welcome Nyoka because she studied theology at the UCA in San Salvador, and I also have very close personal collections with the University of Central America in San Salvador, and particularly with the great theologian John Sobrino. So it's lovely to welcome Nyoka here this afternoon. Nyoka is a believer and theologian who studied theology at the UCA, the cradle of liberation theology, or one of the cradles of liberation theology. She then received a master's degree in dogmatic theology from the University of Comillas in Madrid in 2019. Nyoka promoted the creation of the Yes We Trans program, the first social and labor insertion program for the trans community. She's currently a member of the executive committee of the LGBTIA plus state federation in Spain, and also a member of Krishmon, the LGBT plus I plus believer community there, and of women in the Catholic Church revolt. Moreover, she is a diversity and inclusion trainer in business, a field in which she has achieved due recognition. She also participates in Christian conferences, events, etc., in different believer spaces. Nyoka is an activist and defender of human rights, particularly supporting persons from the LGBTI plus community. And so we look forward now to hearing Nyoka's reflections and contributions.
Gracias por la invitación. No sé si se me oye bien.
Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for this invitation, because I believe it's important for us to be here today, women too, and trans believer women, because it's important for our voices to be heard. I like these two words, love and truth. Talking about love is talking about truth too, and talking about truth is also talking about love. These are not two words that must be separate, but instead they must come together. I want to start talking about God. I think that question that came to my mind when I received the invitation is, what's the God I believe in? Who's the God I have for myself? This is very important. If it's this God love, or this God of the dogma of punishment of sin, which is also a word that comes up in this document. Talking about God is talking about this deep relationship with two important words: trust and availability between this God, Father, Mother, and the Son, Jesus Christ. It's important to ground that love and truth relationship on Jesus when he says, I'm the path to truth and life. Just like I've loved you, you should love one another. What's this image he's conveying? I think that's the core for love and truth, to understand myself too. If he is conveying this image of God, I am that response of love, and that response of love you provide when you feel, or we feel, that we have been flooded by grace. This connection is of utmost importance when we talk about love and truth. I am a response of love, so I am a response of truth too. I think this is important to intertwine it very strongly. If we are a response of love and of truth, we cannot be in sin, we cannot be wrong, so I cannot be an identity without dignity, which has been mentioned too. What dignity are we talking about? What's the dignity of persons? All believers with this grace cannot be a person without dignity or love. Along these same lines, Jesus, this God turned into man, talks about his kingdom, and we must recall what this kingdom is all about, which is very different to the anti-kingdom. If this love is related to the gospel, it can't be linked to situations that do away with your dignity and with your human nature. So there's a first call upon the church that should read the signs of time, the signs of time that we must address, how we must discern to talk about this church today without losing the essence of our gospel. A church that must refresh its tradition. Sometimes we've remained linked to tradition, decoupled from the gospel. Along these lines, I was thinking, if I don't have love, I am nothing. So talking about love is talking about that truth response. And I want to reiterate this: not a situation of sin or of in a negative aspect. If I'm a response that includes love, I have that dignity of being a son or daughter of God. Dignity has been a word that has been very much mentioned, and that has touched about trans a lot lately, because it removes us from this process of being recognized in our identities. And this is very harsh indeed. And this isn't talking about love and truth indeed. James Allison mentioned about the bearers of truth. And I wonder, what is truth? Who are the bearers of such truth? We can't talk about a truth from a European-centered standpoint, from a binary standpoint, from a patriarchal viewpoint. because that is vertical. We have to think about this when talking about truth. This truth must be able to bring together all and everything, and it cuts across intersectionalities and that are related to other voices that are not duly envisaged in this privilege of being the bearers of truth. There is a truth that, as I mentioned before, I'm a response of love, as I say, and that is something that I perceive, but there's an objective truth that comes from the outside where one presupposes there's a common voice, and this truth must be free from prejudice, stereotypes, and biases, because if it's a truth that cannot hear the voice from this inclusive kingdom, it will be a truth that not all people will participate in, as is happening now. The path of truth leads me out of the age of caverns. There's a truth that we see, and there's a truth that they want to make us believe in. When we undergo this process, this path that has joyful times, obscure times of sadness and loneliness, and we also have times in which we don't want to leave our area of comfort where we are told what we have to do. Walking along this path is exiting that situations, coming across a reality that probably, or a truth that you did not expect. This is a journey of love. It's a journey of recognition of each of the persons as we are. And this journey, and for this second part, I think is an anthropological journey too. For many years, I've been thinking that the church must reflect on what is that Christian anthropology that we must think about currently, based on an anthropology of such a mistaken view, a binary view. This will be an anthropology in which many realities are not considered, the realities above all of the trans persons, or all those that are not binary. Some time ago, I made a presentation at a very Christian anthropology conference. It was a presentation made by someone else, sorry, and I felt excluded from that presentation. So we do have to think about this anthropological shift, which will also entail talking about this shift of the bodies, of what's the reality experienced in these bodies that have not been envisaged in a theology that is taught even nowadays. We have to talk about these bodies as sacred bodies. We talk about the bodies as a temple too. Why can't our bodies be sacred? And why aren't they recognized within that notion of dignity? We've been taught that we are in the wrong body. We are still pathological. We are still entities with this image of not having the right gender. I think that the great challenge of this Christian anthropology is to come closer to understand the realities of these identities. When I'm talking about identities, I talk about the human body and the spirit. We are not quite understanding that trans persons, when we talk about our identity, we talk about this deepness, identity is so important that it goes beyond my own capacities. And what I do is to remove this straitjacket I've been put in so as to live as a believer, as a human being. And this is not fully understood. And along these lines, it's important to talk about bodies, our bodies, the bodies of these persons that have an identity that is out of this norm. Our bodies are also sacred and they must be recognized, and they have their dignity. So we can't continue showing the reality as of a biology-based anthropology based on genitals. I mean, this is still aimed at reproductive purposes. And I think we have left aside this kind of notion, but we are still put into this category. So many trans people experience a process that is seeking this integrity of our human nature, cut across by dignity. I'm a bit sad because of, and also hopeful because of this last press release, because I think it's a big blow on this church that does not duly recognize this reality of the trans persons, in which we are told that we are persons without dignity to the eyes of God. And if they do away with my dignity, they do away with my identity and my human nature. So for me, there has to be a strong call upon everyone to reflect on this. If we are talking about God and love, God and truth, what is that love? What is that truth? And also talk about this anthropological shift. I'm sure that this must happen, or else we can't talk about an inclusive church. We can't give that leap towards recognizing many identities left out. We are not only spirit and belief, we are also matter. So from the point of view of unity, we must look at the body, the spirit, the soul as a whole. And if many LGBTI believers are here, we can't be a mistake. We are a response of love. The time has come to invite the church to have spaces where LGBTI plus and trans have a voice. The great problem and the great annoyance at the social and church level is because we do not want, and this I repeat at different conferences, LGBTI plus people don't want us to just receive leftovers. Today we are standing up with a voice, and we have a clean, pure view, and we want to walk hand in hand with this view on an equal footing. We don't demand more, but we don't want less either. And at the social level, if we want our rights to be recognized in the church, we are struggling to have a space that is being denied to us. I think catechesis is obsolete for certain things, so we must bear this in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nyoka, for that very powerful contribution as well. And now I welcome Nikki Bergbach, standing in very, very much the last hours in place of Professor Anna Rowlands. Nicolette Burbach is Social and Environmental Justice Lead at the London Jesuit Centre. Previously, she taught in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. Her research resources the teachings of Pope Francis to navigate the difficulties of the Church's encounter with transness. She also serves on the Pastoral Council for LGBT plus Catholics Westminster here in London. Her forthcoming edited collection with Lisa Sol Cahill, Trans Life and the Catholic Church Today, is due to be published in September 2024 by Bloomsbury Publishing. So welcome, Nikki, now from Durham for the weekend, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Martin, and thank you everyone for having me. Anna Rowland's boots are certainly big ones to fill. I will do my best. So what I was going to start by talking about, actually, James really covered a lot of that kind of content, but I think it bears kind of repeating that this kind of idea of unity between love and truth, on the face of it, it's actually a very kind of intuitive idea. And I think one that kind of almost seems obviously right. You know, when we love someone, we desire what's good for them and we pursue that thing. And this needs to be rooted in a vision of truth, so we know what actually benefits them. Like, I have 2 cats who I love dearly, and I express that love by feeding them. But you know, if I didn't know what it was to be a cat, I might feed them chocolate or something like that, and that would end up poisoning them. I think that's a good principle. Where it goes wrong, and this is also something that James kind of touched on, is when it becomes kind of twisted. And the thing which really leaps out to me about this phrase is the way that it's used in a kind of rhetorical way. There are loads of different ways in which you encounter this, but like, here are 2 examples that are really kind of prominent in the things that I've read. So the first is using it as a tool for dismissing like moral or ethical claims. So you know, imagine you're a trans person and you claim that being a loving organization means not discriminating against trans people in the workplace in some sort of way. And then, you know, some difficult Catholic comes along and says that you're demanding love without any regard to truth, like any regard to the truth of who you are. And the kind of claim underlying this is basically they're acting as if you know that you're really a man or a woman or whatever, but you're just demanding that people ignore this fact, that kind of thing. And the way that this bit of rhetoric or this rhetorical use works is kind of disingenuous. It misrepresents what you say in order to dismiss it. You might be claiming, you know, you discriminating against me is hurting me in this very concrete way. And then they kind of twist it into saying that you just want them to like lie about you, which is a very different kind of claim indeed. Another kind of rhetorical use is that sometimes it's used as a phrase that's so in, I don't know if this translates very well to Spanish, but in English we have a phrase, you know, you have to be cruel to be kind, which basically captures the idea that sometimes what is good for people is not what's nice to people. And you get the phrase used in this way as well, right? You know, you might get a Catholic who says, you know, unity of love and truth, whatever, basically meaning that trans people should be treated as if they're just like crazy people rather than as we say we are. And you reply to them and be like, that's not very loving. If you treat people like this, they'll suffer horribly. It's undignified, it's dehumanizing, all that sort of stuff. And then they turn around and say it's more loving to treat them this way because it reflects the truth, regardless of the kind of suffering it causes. And what this kind of rhetorical use does is it basically explains away the suffering they cause. It becomes just a side effect of them being truthful, and the being truthful bit becomes what's important, and the kind of suffering just kind of disappears in all of it. And you know, so this is bad because it makes people feel comfortable with doing harmful things, or it lets them ignore the harm that they cause. in fact, it can be particularly dangerous because it can take even like well-meaning people, and it kind of teaches them to ignore the harmful ways that they're behaving, because it gets them to think about the truth that they're trying to operate on rather than the harms that they're causing. I think they're being loving. It lets them think about loving in terms of this idea of truth that they have, rather than what's actually benefiting people. I use trans people as an example because that's what I research. It's my own personal experience. I'm also bisexual and know that LGBT people in general will have encountered this sort of thing in all sorts of different ways. So I'm sure what I've just said will be very familiar to you, and you'll probably have a million other examples you can just like pull off the top of your head. I think though that having a clear sense of what the unity of love and truth actually means can also kind of help us. It can help us to counteract these sorts of abuses of the principle. These sorts of rhetorical uses of the principle, they actually kind of contradict the principle because they ignore the relationship between truth and love. They help people to ignore the truth of the injustices that they visit upon people. It helps them ignore the truth of our need and of the moral responsibilities that flow from it. So in this kind of context, the unity of truth and love as a principle reminds us that like love demands we're treated in ways that actively benefit us. Our cries for justice can't be dismissed and our suffering can't be ignored. These are all important truths that must be recognized. We cannot ignore the truth of the injustices we face, or Catholics cannot ignore the truth of the injustices we face if they want to be loving towards us. So this kind of meeting is also about the synod. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what this might mean in terms of our position in the wider kind of synodal process. And then I'll finish by talking a bit about this recent document that's just come out that was mentioned by the last speaker, Dignitas Infinita. So Francis, in a papal speech recently, called for Catholics to take the synod into its prophetic stage, which he explained as meaning translating the work of the preceding phases into choices that give zeal and new life to the Church's mission in our time. I found this a little hard to read as an LGBT Catholic, in part because the synodal process in many ways didn't work out that great for us. LGBT plus people weren't actively included in the synod to begin with, and we had to come together as groups within our own parish communities. LGBT Catholics community, Westminster did this. It's happened in other places as well, but in terms of the actual sessions at the synod in Rome, no LGBT plus people were actively included, even though our lives and the issues around them were identified as key ones for the synod. If you then read the kind of document that came out of the synod, some of the wider thought that came out of the synod, in fact, the framing of the issues affecting our lives are problematic. Painting LGBT rights as a kind of colonizing ideology, those sorts of things. I don't need to go through these tropes, you'll definitely know them. And then like later things produced by the church, nominally in the spirit of the synod, supposedly reacting to the issues which came up in the synod and continuing this kind of synodal reflection, things like the recent Dignitas Infinita, they just kind of retread old ground. They don't show any sort of real understanding of our lives, nor even much for will to like grow in that understanding. It's just saying what people have always said. They clearly haven't responded in any way to how we think of ourselves, how we explain our lives. Sometimes people might say we're included, but there's no kind of real evidence of that, either in how people have understood the process to have happened, or even if you read the documents themselves. So in a kind of certain respect, synodality didn't work out so great for us. It's had many, I think there have been many successful aspects to it, but in terms of specifically LGBT people, maybe we're a little bit left behind. So the idea of kind of continuing that process into the future, it kind of raises the risk that we'll continue to be left behind going forwards as well. Synodality will just become like a label that the church can stamp onto things to make it feel good and feel like it's being participatory or whatever, without it actually being like that. On the other hand, a big theme in the synod was working out what synodality actually is. And perhaps the most significant part of these preceding phases, as Francis called them, to carry forwards, is the kind of attempt to work out what the synodal life of the church should look like. And this, I think, is something that we need to continue to contribute to, but also the unity of truth and love can be a guiding principle for addressing this, at least when understood properly, as I see it. Now, synodality is a way of living out the communion that lies at the heart of the church's life. Its kind of main bit, it's kind of rooted in the Eucharist and the kind of life that flows from the Eucharist. And that communion itself is one of love. When we come together in the Eucharist, we come together in a bond of love. And if love must be in unity with truth, then that means there can be no real communion without the truth that makes that love authentic. And there can be no synodality without the authentic love that requires, or without the truth that would make the love authentic, that creates the communion, that is the kind of basis for synodality. So this really, I think, foregrounds the importance of properly understanding LGBT people in order to know what is good for us. And this should actually be a challenge to these sorts of complacent attitudes that we see in the church, with people not wanting to actually know, what injustices we're facing, people trying to just dismiss our claims to suffering or dismiss the kind of moral claims that we're making, often with this kind of bad use of the phrase. I also think, though, that part of this process can be a case of moving beyond the sorts of issues that we just get stuck on. I've heard a lot about, or previous speakers have spoken a lot about anthropological issues. So, what is it to be a human? How does your gender or your sexual life, whatever, kind of reflect that? But I also think that an important truth of our lives is just that we're hurt in quite prosaic ways. For example, Dignitas Infinita, the recent document issued by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, big attack on transness, basically saying that it's just trying to do whatever you want with your body without paying any attention to the truth of the human body and its value and stuff like that. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales recently issued a document which they identify as kind of in continuity with that. They called it intrinsically woven by God. What's important about this document is that it's a bit more concrete. It gives you a view of what the world that Dignitas Infinita is trying to construct would look like. So it explicitly rejects medical and social transition. It says that Catholic organizations should avoid using language associated with gender ideology. And its kind of vision for pastoral accompaniment for trans people is to help us to rediscover and cherish their humanity as it was conceived and created by God, body and soul, which is to say, to get us to stop being trans, right? That's what that means. And this is just a world like that would just be a nightmare to live in. Like being a trans person going to a Catholic school that refuses to use any language associated with gender ideology and refuses to allow you to socially transition and just tries to make you cis. That would be a nightmare. Going to a Catholic hospital where you're just constantly misgendered or put in the wrong ward or just, viewed as a sick person who needs to be led back to the truth by a well-meaning medical professional who then ignores what's actually wrong with you, sort of trans broken arm syndrome, as healthcare activists would call it, that kind of thing. So that would be a nightmare. But again, there is a truth to the suffering that's involved there. And perhaps a church that really wants to pay attention to the unity of truth and love needs to understand that if it wants to be loving to us, then it has to actually not do these harmful things that are truly harmful. And I think that in some ways, actually, these issues are the most pressing ones, right? The anthropological issue, it's a theoretical issue that underlies everything, but people are kind of being hurt by this sort of stuff every day. And it might even be possible to get more kind of traction on these sorts of issues, because I think it's easier to make the case to a bishop that, misgendering people in a hospital hurts them, even if they might have a dubious anthropology between how they think of themselves or something. So these may be truths that are more apparent to the people with power than the more kinds of abstract or theoretical ones about human nature. Sorry, yeah, the second document I referred to is called Intrinsically Woven by God. It's by the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. That's kind of all I have to say today. Sorry, that became a bit rambling towards the end. But yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up. It's been a really invigorating conversation this afternoon. I just want to say that from all 4 webinars, we will be producing a submission for the synod process. Also important, and we haven't mentioned it in the conversation this afternoon, but also important is the fact that Pope Francis has now established various study groups to continue to look more intensively at some of the questions that we've been discussing in these webinars. As James mentioned, in some ways, fiducia supplicans on blessings and dignitas infinita have been the last breath of non-synodal pontifications, if you like.
From the DDF.
Yeah, and so our submission will be picking up some of these points. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, but particular thanks to James Allison, Niocha Gibaya, and Nikki Burbach for enlivening our discussion today. Thanks to Miro as well for managing the technical side, and also to my colleagues in the Synodal Project team who have been working. We've been working hard during these few months to try and listen to what's going on and to be the voices of so many of our sisters and brothers who feel their voices are not being heard. So thank you, everyone. And good evening and God bless.